Hello and welcome to today's PSU Transportation Seminar. My name is Jason Anderson and I will be introducing, moderating, and speaking for today's seminar. Our Friday transportation seminars have been a tradition. There we go. Since the year 2000, these seminars are usually held live on Portland State University's urban campus, located on the ancestral homelands of the Multnomah, Cathlamet, Clackamas, Tumwater, Watlala bands of the Chinook, the Tualatin, Kalapuya, and many other indigenous nations of the Columbia River. It is important to acknowledge that we are here because of the sacrifices forced on the indigenous ancestors of this place, remember these communities, and to honor their legacy, lives, and descendants. Today, we are pleased to have myself, as well as Elizabeth Yates, presenting on the impacts of a multimodal safety project on North Lombard Street in Portland, Oregon. And here's a brief summary of what to expect in today's seminar. I'm research faculty here at Portland State University. I'm also an adjunct as well. Most of my research centers around transportation safety, transportation policy, and my area of expertise is in the data analytics, data science realm. Elizabeth Yates is a graduate student and a NITSE scholar, and she's a fantastic graduate student, and she's also the Portland State University video data reduction expert, I would say. She's been doing a fantastic job with that type of research for a handful of years now. Here's a preview of some upcoming seminars. As an overview of today's seminar, you can expect our speaker to present for about 45 minutes, followed by a Q&A session. We will be receiving questions through the Q&A feature on your Zoom control panel, and we will ask them at the end of the presentation. If we run out of time for all of your questions, we will give our speaker the opportunity to email written responses for any questions left unanswered. We have enabled closed captioning, but you must click on the CC feature to view them. We will be recording today's webinar. It will be available on our website later today, along with the presentation slides. If you are tracking professional development hours, this webinar is eligible for 1 hour of continuing education credit. With that, let's begin today's seminar. Jason, yay, okay, the transfer from moderator to speaker, and here I am out of nowhere. All right, so as mentioned, Elizabeth and I are going to talk about the impacts of a multimodal safety project on North Lombard Street in Portland, Oregon. Before we get into it, I want to emphasize that this was sort of the first step in a rigorous before-after study, where we're limited by some of the before data that we have and be able to compare that to after data. And we'll talk a little bit about that at the end of today's seminar, specifically with before and after recommendations for agencies that are considering doing a before-after study. Control, there we go. Perfect. So because this is a research project, the seminar or the presentation today is going to be very much structured like that. So we'll do a brief introduction. We'll talk a little bit about the data collection process, the methods we use for analysis, and then we'll go in and talk about the results, provide an overall summary, and then answer the question, what were the impacts of this multimodal safety project? And then we'll finish by listing some key before-after recommendations for agencies to consider when conducting before-after studies or before-after evaluations. So first, where and what is North Lombard Street and or US 30 bypass? So on this section of North Lombard Street, it is also US 30. It's a critical corridor for both commercial and residential needs and interests. A study or an analysis that was done based on 2017 to 2021 data indicated that this corridor was ranked 11th in the Portland area in terms of fatal and serious injury crashes. Also, over that time period, over 50% of crashes that occurred resulted in some form of an injury. Now, this analysis has not been updated since that analysis, and so we are unsure currently what the ranking of this corridor is, and we would need some additional after years of safety data to really assess if there was any effect due to this reconfiguration. The Oregon Department of Transportation and the Portland Bureau of Transportation partnered to improve multimodal safety and accessibility for all users on this section of North Lombard Street. The section specifically was from North Fiske Ave to North Boston Ave. That section has a speed limit of 35 miles per hour, and then construction ended in 2022. So here's an image of the project area, and you can find this on the Oregon Department of Transportation website. So we'll see over on the left, North Fiske Ave, where that orange dot is. Those orange dots represent intersection improvements that were made along this corridor. The hatched line markings indicate roadway configuration, whether that's new pavement, bike lanes, a center turn lane, and ADA ramps. And then the blue stars, represent activated pedestrian signals, specifically RRFBs, also included with a median refuge island. And so we'll keep coming back to not necessarily this map, but maps to kind of remind us where this location is as we go through some of the results. The next question would be, what improvements were made specifically? So there were 177 new curb ramps that meet ADA requirements as part of this improvement project. 91 safer crosswalks, so improved visibility, reflective paint, no obstructions, and so forth, as well as fewer lanes to cross. There were 2.4 miles of new buffered bike lanes, 1.3 miles of new pavement, as well as center turn lanes. And we'll look at some before-after photos. 5 new traffic signals, so we saw that on the previous slide, and then 2 new pedestrian activated crossings. And as I mentioned, these were specifically RRFBs and median that were accompanied with median refuge islands. So here's some examples of the before and after scenario. So on the top here, you have the before condition, right? There's no bike lanes. It's 2 lanes each direction with a double yellow line dividing traffic flow. The bottom, you have an aerial view of a section between North Drummond Ave and North Oatman Avenue. You can see now it's 1 lane each direction. The wearing surface is new. There's that center turn lane that both directions of travel are permitted to use. There's the buffered bike lanes on both sides. And then this pedestrian crossing we see here is one of the RRFBs that were installed. We can also see the median refuge island. And then we can also see the new curb ramps that were part. You can see some over here as well, that are now ADA compliant. This is a great view of a section of North Lombard Street here that didn't have safe pedestrian crossings. And it's really apparent here in these before-after photos, the improvements that were made along this section. And so what we're seeing on the bottom here is a close-up of that RRFB. So a pedestrian activates this, the rectangular lights start flashing rapidly, cars yield immediately, hopefully, and then there's the median refuge island, and then the pedestrian crosses. And as you saw in the previous slide, right, that distance has been shortened. It's no longer those 4 lanes. It's been shortened up quite a bit. And then finally, a before-after of the 177 new ADA compliant curb ramps that were installed throughout this section of North Lombard Street. And you can see that there's a vast difference here between the before picture and the after picture. So what was our job then as the research team in terms of evaluating what were the conditions before compared to the conditions after? And so we wanted to look at both safety and operational impacts. And we wanted to consider, things that we could evaluate based on the data that was available to us. And we'll talk a little bit, Elizabeth, both and I, in terms of what data was available, and then some of those data limitations as well. So we wanted to look at, were there any changes, in pedestrian volumes or pedestrian counts and crosswalk delay in the before and after period? Were there any changes in vehicle-pedestrian conflicts? Were there any changes in average speed, vehicle speed? Were there any changes in average travel time, so vehicle travel time across this portion of North Lombard Street? And then we also looked at, were there any changes in exposure? And we looked at 2 measures for that. We looked at throughput, which was collected through the video data, how many vehicles were going through the intersections. And then we also looked at vehicle miles traveled, and we did some comparisons with the vehicle miles traveled at similar corridors on the east side of Portland, as well as VMT overall throughout the Portland metropolitan area. All right, so we're going to talk a little bit now about the data collection. I'm going to give a brief highlight, and then I'll pass it over to Elizabeth to talk a little bit about the video data. So we had before video data for locations. Most had 2017. A couple of them also had some 2018 data. And then all of them had 2019 data. And then the after data was collected in 2023. And what was extracted from here were volumes, both pedestrian and vehicle, as well as other users. Elizabeth will touch on that. Conflicts were used, or the video was used to extract conflicts, specifically those between vehicles and pedestrians, and then pedestrian delays, specifically crosswalk user delay. The data we use for the speed and travel time, so the operational characteristics, and speed has that element of safety as well, was collected from RRFBs. So that was one of our first limitations, was the format that RRFBs provides its data. It's aggregated, and we'll get into that a little bit more later. But we looked at 3 specific periods based on some of the data that had been collected before the project started. And so to be consistent with the years of the video data, as well as some of that data that was provided to us, we elected these about 2.5-week periods in 2017, 2019, and 2023. And we're not going to do a full breakdown of the segment level analysis today. That's getting a little bit too much into the weeds. But we did do a segment-based analysis because that's how you get the data from RRFBs. They have these various segments based on INRIX data. And you'll notice that this doesn't go to Boston Avenue. So most of the time, these segments start on intersection, end on intersection, or you can adjust it so that it can start on intersection and end on intersection. At this particular location on North Lombard Street, that last little bit from Delaware to Boston, it ran over Boston Ave. And so for most of the analysis, we excluded that, but we did also consider, travel time and speed beyond Delaware Ave, including those few extra segments, and there was no substantial difference. The results were very similar. And then here's a look at the analysis segments and then the analysis corridor overall. And that little point that I was just talking about was this little red portion on the far right of the map, where there wasn't a segment on RRFBs that represented only this. It would run over all the way to here or run over to here. And so we did a couple of additional analysis to see if we include this runoff over this intersection of Boston Ave, and maybe even a little bit further to kind of where the queuing might start, where the on-ramp is here. Are we seeing any significant differences if we include those? In the end, we did not. All right, so I'm going to hand it over to Elizabeth now for a bit to talk about the video data methods. Elizabeth, go for it. You might need this.
Okay, thanks. Hi. So we got video from the before period and the after period. We were very limited by the video from the before period, and I'll go over that a little bit more later. But I want to show you what we were able to extract, and it's kind of surprising given what we had. But we had the intersection, the crossing event number, a video timestamp, which crosswalk they used, the direction of the user type. We did mostly pedestrians and cyclists, but we do keep track of things like scooters, one-wheels, skateboards, all of that. The number of people who are crossing, the time of day, and then we have arrival time, which I get a lot of questions about what user arrival time is. And that's generally, it is a little subjective, but when a user steps to the point where they want to cross and they sort of look up, I count that as arrival time. They're alert, they're looking for signals about whether or not it's safe to cross. Then we have when they actually start crossing, which is when their first foot steps off of the curb pavement, and the end time, which is when the last foot steps off of the road pavement. And then these were automatically calculated for me, the time difference between the start time and the arrival time, that is user delay. And then the user crossing time is end time minus start time. And then the next thing that we extracted from the video is something called PET, or post-encroachment time, where for this study, we were doing pedestrians here and right turning vehicles. And so we defined our conflict zone as any point in the crosswalk where the vehicle could turn. Some of them turned rather tight, some of them turned way out here, and the pedestrian could potentially have a conflict. And this is collected by getting a timestamp of when the first, when the first inhabitant leaves the conflict zone, minus when the second user enters the conflict zone, right? So if you have the car entering first, you would take a timestamp here for the front bumper, a timestamp there for the rear bumper, right? And then the pedestrian comes and enters here and then leaves here. Or if they're crossing from here, they can actually enter here and leave here. And you have both scenarios of crosswalk user entering first and vehicle entering first. So here you go. Here's my spreadsheet of how I collected this. I think it's pretty explanatory. We have arrival departure time. And again, we have an event unit, and that's the crosswalk user or the motor vehicle. So you can see motor vehicle came first, then the pedestrian, or again, it could be a cyclist. And then we have an actual PET value, which is in seconds, and then a severity. The thresholds for these severities are 0 to 1.5 seconds is considered a high severity. 1.5 to 3 seconds is like a medium severity, and 3 to 5 seconds is low severity, and over 5 seconds is considered no conflict. But I collected everything that was 10 seconds and less. And then over here, this is something I was only able to do for the after data, and I'll talk about why a little bit later. When we had a high severity PET, I used some landmarks and timestamps to calculate the motor vehicle speed. So we can see that this one was going 6.82 miles per hour and had a high severity conflict of 1.4 seconds. And
can you explain real quick how PET is used to define a conflict? Like practically,
sure.
Like what does that value mean?
That value is the time difference between the motor vehicle and the crosswalk user occupying the same space, right? If you have a PET of 0 and your conflict zone is very small, you could say that there was a crash or a near crash, right? And so because motor vehicle and crosswalk user crashes are so few and could be underreported as well, it's rare to be able to have sufficient number of those to analyze. And so we use something called a surrogate safety measure, which is what a PET is. And that says, what is the time to a crash? So they were 1.4 seconds away from colliding in that conflict zone.
Thanks for that additional definition, Elizabeth.
Sure.
So in addition to the video methods, there was the methods in which the RRFBs data was used. And again, that was based on the speed and the travel time. And so essentially we did a large descriptive analysis with both the speed and the travel time. This consisted of, tabular statistics, visual statistics. We'll look at a little bit of both today, focusing specifically on average hourly speed and average hourly travel time. So you're wondering, why are we looking at average hourly speed and hourly travel time? This has to do with the nature of RRFBs data. So you're getting data that's aggregated at some level already. And then you have to play how comfortable are you with doing additional aggregations on top of an already aggregated data set? And so there's that trade-off, and we elected to use average hourly speed and average hourly travel time because RRFBs already provides that data in those hourly aggregation bins. You can get more granular data, but it's still aggregated. So you're not getting those like per vehicle measurements of speed or per vehicle measurements of travel time. We did a corridor level analysis for travel time specifically. The way that the speed data works, it doesn't really allow for that. which the segment analysis was the basis for the speed. And then we looked at direction of travel, day of the week, so weekend versus weekday, as well as time of day, and literally each hour of the day, as well as those peak hour periods in the morning and the evening. The report should be published soon, and details on all of those elements will be in the report. We also looked at the statistical differences between average hourly speeds and travel time. This was done through a series of just t-tests, looking at differences between hours of day, days of week, and so forth. And again, we're not going to dive too much into that, but I will summarize some high-level results from those t-tests. And then we also compared speed and travel time metrics to nearby corridors or segments, right? So did nearby corridors or segments or upstream or downstream of this project corridor experience similar trends? Did they see, for example, speed reduction if the project area experienced a speed reduction? Did they experience increases in travel time if the project area saw increases in travel time, and so forth? And for that, we used North Lombard Street just to the west of the project area. So about 1.5 miles leading into that North Fiske Ave. And then we looked at North Columbia Boulevard, about the same distance as the project area, which runs parallel to North Lombard Street to the north. And then for the exposure, where we looked at vehicle throughput as well as vehicle miles traveled. Vehicle throughput, again, was just a descriptive analysis where we wanted to see what was the difference between the number of vehicles going through the intersection, not turning right, not turning left, just going straight through the intersection between the before and after periods. And this was done by collecting the number of vehicles through the video reduction process. And then the data was collected during peak hour conditions. So the video data represented 7 a.m. to 9 a.m. in the morning, and then 4 p.m. to 6 p.m. in the evening. For the vehicle miles traveled, we compared VMT in the project area to similar east-west segments. So not all that different than what we did for the travel time and speed. And the corridors we considered were North Columbia Boulevard. So again, runs parallel to North Lombard to the north. And then North Willamette Boulevard, which runs parallel to the south. And then we also compared overall arterial VMT and overall VMT for all roads in the Portland area to determine if there was a trend that we could see going on, and if the VMT on North Lombard Street was significantly different from the overall VMT trend that we saw throughout the city of Portland. And so this simply just shows a map of the corridors that we considered for the VMT comparison. So that dark blue line on the top is North Columbia Boulevard. The sort of wide yellowish green line in the middle, that's North Lombard Street. And then this red line here on the bottom is North Willamette Boulevard. Those are kind of the three major east-west arterial type roads going in this area of Portland. All right, so we're going to talk about the results a little bit. Elizabeth is going to go through a lot of the video data results, and then she'll pass it back to me, and I'll talk about the speed and travel time, as well as the vehicle throughput and exposure analysis.
All right, so in total, over 5,000 crosswalk users were counted. There is a general decrease overall from users in 2017, that's the purple line, to 2019, this lovely teal, and then but an increase from 2019 overall to 2023. And it is mixed. I will say, like North Emerald Avenue had no infrastructure for pedestrians, and then they put in an RRFB, right? So that's pretty self-explanatory. North Drummond had a crosswalk and had it removed. So again, this went from a 2 crosswalk intersection to a 1 crosswalk intersection, and that's why we see that decline there. You know, there were some other that were interesting where, again, this North Emerald, we had almost nobody crossing the street. Later, a restaurant was put in, and at lunchtime, suddenly everybody was going to get their burger. So it was interesting to look at that. And then, oh, wait. Okay. So here we have the difference in the AM and PM volumes. I think we can see it's a similar trend, you know, as far as the increase and decrease. I didn't see that there was a lot of difference between AM and PM overall for people in the PM. And I will say we only collected from 7 AM to 7 PM for this. Also, these are our observed conflicts. And like I talked about, these are our thresholds, right, for severe, medium, low severity. And so by location, you'll notice there's fewer locations here than there are in the whole section. And that's because you can only collect PETs at signalized intersections, not at RRFBs or uncontrolled locations. So is this before?
This is the total.
This is total.
Total.
Total conflicts for the whole
Overall.
thing. Okay.
We break it
So
up.
we had 46 of the high severity, 44 medium, and 29 low severity conflicts, 119. And that shows that even collecting the surrogate safety measure of PET, they're out of 5,000 users, right? We had 119 potential conflicts. So even conflicts is rare enough that you have to see a lot of users to see potential problems. Oh, what do I press to get it to play?
I'll press it over here.
Okay, here's an example of a low severity PET. Right, so the pedestrian has already made it across the center line before the vehicles go. I don't think anybody would say that that's a dangerous situation. Next, we have the medium severity. Oh, and these are all at Greeley and Lombard. Again, the pedestrian is well onto the sidewalk here before the vehicles go, but you can tell that that's a little bit of a closer pass. And that lead vehicle is going a little bit faster, I think, than we saw in the previous video. And finally, our high severity PET. Where the vehicle didn't wait back here behind the stop line, but moved close to the crosswalk and waited there for the pedestrian to finish crossing before going. So those are your examples of PET. And the reason I brought up speed was because what you would like to do when you are studying PET for safety is then take these high severity PETs and get the vehicle turning speed, which is generally an average. So there's going to be some error there. Take a timestamp here of the front axle, here of the front axle, here of the front axle, here of the front axle. You have this distance and this distance. You average these two speeds. You get an idea of about what speed that vehicle is turning. Generally, a combination of a high severity PET, so that's less than 1.5 seconds, plus a vehicle speed of greater than 15 miles an hour is really where we're concerned. But again, because we were so limited in the video provided in the before period, although I could measure vehicle speed in the after period, I couldn't in the before period. So there was no way to really compare that. Okay, so here we have PETs before and after. So high severity in the before, 15, after 17. You say, that's not great. But then in our median category, we had 27 in the before period and 17 in the after. In our low severity, 14 in the before and 15 in the after. So that's pretty close. Total number of conflicts, 70 before, 49 after. So there is a reduction in overall conflicts. Those are rates. And it's the same information, but showing you by percentage. Since again, this is a low number, it's good to look at the percent over the same period. So we can see a decrease, a small one, generally, from the before and after. Again, 2.73% conflicts out of, however many users. It's pretty good. And then delay. And the reason we talk about user delay is because the longer a pedestrian has to wait, the more likely they are to cross in an unsafe manner, right? They're going to burn the end of that signal a little bit. Maybe, look at the vehicle speed and go, I can make that, and just go. So if you decrease delay, you increase compliance. So we see that we have an average delay of like almost 5 seconds here, and it goes down to less than 3. So that is encouraging. Overall, we saw a decrease in delay, again, except at Emerald, because they went from nothing to having an RRFB to push. So if you were crossing there in the beginning, you were already doing something you weren't supposed, well, there's a corner there. It's a crosswalk. So yeah, we have decreases in delay all around, so that's encouraging. And now we're on to speed.
Yeah, cool. So thank you, Elizabeth. So the next few slides in regards to speed and travel time are at the segment level. For speed, we have to show this because we can't compute these speed metrics over the whole segment. Now we can get space mean speed over that whole segment, but it doesn't tell the story of what's potentially happening, a mile away or 3 point. It doesn't capture those differences in behavior between those different locations. So in speed here, what I want to point out are 2 key trends, right? So the red the darker the red, the higher the increase in speed, indicating less safe for pedestrians and bicycles and multimodal use. And the more green and into the yellow indicates a larger decrease in average hourly speed, which indicates safer conditions, like vehicles are traveling slower, drivers have better time to react to potential conflicts. And what I want to point out here is that notice from 2017 to 2019, with the exception of these 2 segments here, there's an increase in speed. And then after the project completion, so that 2019 to 2023 period, every segment along the project area that we looked at had a decrease in speed. This is in complete opposite of what the trend is overall in terms of speed measurements in Portland, through Oregon as a whole, and the United States as a whole, where post-pandemic, people are driving faster. So this is a good sign indicating that speeds have been slower, improving multimodal safety. And then to put into perspective, right, what is a 26.2% decrease in speed? Well, that's a decrease of about 7 miles per hour. That's a tangible decrease in speed that a pedestrian or a cyclist can feel, an improved level of traffic stress. And then this is just a visual component of that. Essentially, right, we're seeing that in 2023, which are those yellow bars, they are quite a bit lower than the other 2 colored bars, indicating that decrease in speed. On the travel time side of things, and you'll notice the complete opposite trend because of the way that INRIX or that RIDIS has this data, right? They're interrelated. If speed's increasing, travel time's decreasing. If travel time's increasing, speed is decreasing, right? And so we're going to see those similar trends as we kind of go throughout the rest of the results here. And that's what we see here, right? So a decrease in travel time indicating people were likely driving faster. Speeds were higher from that 2017 to 2019, with the exception of these 2 segments here. And then increases in travel time from 2019 to 2023 across each of the segments that we looked at along the project area. So what I want to point out here now is 37% seems like a really large increase, right? And that might be taken like 37% increase in travel time. However, when we look at that in terms of what that really is, it's a 4-second increase. This is a second increase. This is a travel time increase that is very, very unlikely to be felt by the user themselves. So a pretty negligible increase in regards to what a driver would feel inside the vehicle going across North Lombard Street. And then this plot shows, or these two figures here, show the same thing, where the yellow bars represent 2023, and then the travel time was higher in 2023 compared to the previous years. So again, the opposite trend of what we see for speed. And that was the general thing that we saw throughout looking at speed and travel time. And so this here shows just an example of some of the more in-depth by hour analysis that we did. So those shaded regions on the plots indicate the video data collection period. So those can just be used to see that this was the speed during the time the video was happening. So we can compare, sort of link like what type of speeds or travel times we were seeing at that time. These plots specifically indicate travel time. And you can see mostly it's the eastbound direction that experience kind of those larger differences. Now the plots do make it look like it's a large difference, but if we look at the values on the y-axis, we're talking 30 seconds, 40 seconds, right? Sometimes 60 seconds. And this is just an average over that 2.5 week period that we talked about before. So again, overall, not significant. That would be really felt by the user of the vehicle. In terms of comparing speed and travel or travel time specifically to nearby segments, this map shows this section is the project area. This is that section of North Columbia that runs parallel. And then the section just to the west, where we wanted to see, were there any changes in travel time along these segments over those time periods as well? Or were we just observing it here within the project area? And so that's what this table summarizes. And again, the more red, the larger the increase, the more green, the larger the decrease. And what we see here is that the eastbound direction, again, we'll talk a little bit about this with VMT and potential changes in travel behavior and travel patterns, is that the eastbound direction really saw the biggest increases in travel time. And this should say seconds, not minutes. Typo by me. And so what we see here, though, is that the project area, which is the first row, North Fiske to North Delaware, right, has the largest increase in travel time. And again, those units are in seconds, not minutes. And then just to the west also experienced an increase, but only a 10-second increase. So about a third of what the project area experienced, and the same in the weekday and the weekends. And then that North Columbia Boulevard segment experienced a decrease, indicating that the trends that we're seeing, across the country in terms of higher speeds, less travel times, is likely happening on that particular segment of North Columbia Boulevard. And again, units are in seconds, not in minutes. This shows some of the results from the throughput analysis. And so what we see here is pretty straightforward. We see everything is decreased. Sorry, capacity was decreased. We went from 2 lanes each direction to 1 lane each direction. And so we would expect some level of reduction in vehicle throughput at the intersections. And that's exactly what we're observing here. So reduction in exposure is good. So if we think of safety performance functions, right, a key contributing factor to crash frequency outcomes is exposure, whether you're talking about vehicles, pedestrians, cyclists. And so reduction in exposure while also minimizing increases in travel time to a negligible amount that's felt by the user is the best of both worlds here. And then this just shows that visually as well, right? And kind of illustrates like how much of a difference we saw in the eastbound direction in the morning period, likely capturing some form of commuter behavior, because we sort of see that mimicked again then in the westbound direction in the PM. So what about vehicle miles traveled? This allowed us to compare exposure on the project segment as well as across the city and some nearby segments. So VMT, this is measured by ODOT's traffic data section. It's part of reporting to the HPMS, or the Highway Performance Monitoring System. It represents the VMT on record. Again, North Columbia Boulevard and North Willamette Boulevard were the routes that were chosen for this. As we saw that map, they're really the only other major east-west arterials or corridors in that area of Portland. So what did those results tell us? So North Lombard Street, a pretty substantial reduction in VMT from 2019 to 2023, over 20% reduction in VMT. But what happens when we start looking at these similar east-west segments, and then what happens when we look at Portland metro arterials only, and then all roads around the Portland metropolitan area, right? Almost a 6% decrease on North Columbia Boulevard. So also a decrease, but not quite as large. North Walnut Boulevard, 3.5% decrease. Again, a decrease, but not quite as large. And then when we consider overall across the Portland metropolitan area, right, we still have these decreases. Arterials about a 1.5% decrease in VMT, and Portland metro roads, all roads, excuse me, about a 3% decrease in VMT. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about this later, but this is representative of some of that travel, post-pandemic travel behavior changes that we've observed, specifically working from home. So I'm going to go ahead and summarize now. So crosswalk user volumes, number of crosswalk users decreased 2017 to 19, but increased from 2019 to 2023. Again, this was no causal based analysis. We're limited by our data, but it does provide maybe there's some evidence that this reconfiguration increased pedestrian activity along this section of North Lombard Street. The majority of users observed during the video were pedestrians. The second were cyclists. And then not all crosswalk were counted at all years. As Elizabeth stated, there were some issues with video data in terms of the view of the video and being able to accurately collect what's needed to be able to include in the analysis. From a conflict perspective, there were 119 conflicts observed across all 6 locations that were considered. Recall that a conflict is anything less than or equal to 5 seconds. And then there's those little buckets or severity buckets within those 5 seconds, where we have high severity, 39%, medium severity, 37%, and then low severity, 24%. And this is across both before after periods, right? So these aren't broken down to percentage before, percentage after. A key point to take away from this, though, is that the minimum and mean PET decreased, meaning that those got smaller, the minimum and the mean, and the maximum PET increased in the after period. Meaning that in the after period, this PET value is higher, indicating that we're seeing lower severity conflicts, which is good in terms of safety. From a speed and travel time perspective, right, we saw decreases in average hourly speed. And then since speed and travel time have that inverse relationship, we saw increases in average hourly travel time. The eastbound segments and the eastbound direction of the North Lombard corridor in general is really what had the most significant differences in both speed and travel time. And differences in the westbound direction were present, but they were less pronounced. And we saw a little bit of that on that plot that we saw that had the hours on the x-axis. North Lombard Street to the west had a smaller increase, but an increase nonetheless in average hourly travel time. And then when we looked at the North Columbia Boulevard corridor to the north in parallel, it had a decrease in average hourly rate, kind of following those higher speed trends, lower travel time trends that we're seeing across the country. From the throughput and VMT analysis, the vehicle throughput decreased substantially. And we saw that on that slide with that table. And again, that's a result that we would expect based on going from 2 lanes to 1 lane in each direction. Most notable in the morning in the eastbound direction, as we saw, likely capturing some of that commuter behavior. VMT also decreased substantially compared to nearby segments, right? At over 20% decrease compared to the next highest at just under 6%. What does this mean? Well, it's unclear if this larger reduction in VMT was a result of the reconfiguration itself, right? We have to be mindful of what VMT is a function of. Capacity, population, employment, economic conditions, travel behavior is a big one, and we could list many, many others. The post-pandemic travel behavior has changed, most notably people working from home. If you're still commuting to, campus or work in the morning, right, you might see odd traffic trends of why is it congested in this direction at this time, or why is it not congested when it used to be congested on my drive in the morning and so forth. And a lot of that has to do with less people commuting because more people are working from home. This helps explain some of this overall trend that we're seeing in decreasing VMT throughout the Portland area. Nonetheless, some additional VMT specific studies would be required to better explain these VMT differences. So in the end, what are the overall impacts of the project, right? The idea was what did this reconfiguration and all these improvements have on safety? And I'll talk about another component that they had. So the increase in number of pedestrians provides, again, some evidence that multimodal projects can increase pedestrian activity. More people are walking, less people are driving. Lower VMT, right? There's a climate aspect to that as well, getting people out of their vehicles and walking. Reduction in crosswalk user delay decreases the likelihood of risky crossing behavior, as Elizabeth mentioned. All of the user delays that were determined in this study fall well within the range based on the Highway Safety Manual that we wouldn't expect pedestrians to engage in any risky behavior based on the delays that we've observed. Again, improving safety. The reductions in average vehicle speed, that kind of speaks for itself in terms of improving safety, right? Safe speeds is a key element of the safe systems approach, reducing speeds. The data shows that speeds have been reduced along this section of North Lombard Street. Again, improving safety. And then both with the throughput analysis as well as the reduction in VMT shows us that we're reducing exposure, which again has the climate component of it if we're reducing the number of vehicles and VMT on the roadway, and then also increasing safety. Again, exposure is a key contributing factor in every safety performance function describing crash frequency. And so by reducing exposure, we're improving safety. And it's really important to note that despite increases in travel time, it wasn't significant enough to be felt by the user. We're not talking 5 minutes, 10 minutes increases in travel time. We're talking seconds, 20 seconds, 30 seconds, right? Amounts of time that are unlikely to be felt by the user, while also improving all of these other elements in terms of safety, as well as reducing VMT and throughput, which has that greenhouse gas emissions and climate goal as well. So before we finish, I want to hit on some before-after recommendations because this was a big part of this study as well. So, okay, if agencies want to do these before-after evaluations, right, what are some good recommendations on things to consider if we are going to do a before-after evaluation in the future? So these are some really important points that we've outlined. So first would be consider the types of data that are needed, right? So what you're doing a project, what do you want to evaluate after the completion of the project? Do you want to evaluate exposure or traffic volumes? Do you want to evaluate safety? Do you want to evaluate operational characteristics, speed, travel time, right? There has to be a consideration of what types of data are needed so that the data is collected in the before period. Then the data can be collected in the after period and you have consistent data to be able to do the before-after evaluation. It's also too important to consider how the data will be collected and then how much data is needed. Some types of analysis you can get away with maybe a smaller sample size. Other types of analysis, such as assessing the safety, right? You need 3 years of after data and at least 3 years of before data. So you need a substantial amount of data compared to some other types of analysis. So be really mindful of that. It's also important to consider data collection technologies, right? These keep improving and coming out and you're able to collect different types of characteristics, different pieces of information. So be mindful and consider the different types of data technology, data collection technologies. It's important to consider the data collection periods and the aggregation levels, right? Are you capturing peak behavior? Are you capturing weekend versus weekday behavior, daytime versus nighttime behavior? All of that matters when you're going to compare behavior in a before-after evaluation, right? We can't compare, nighttime video to daytime video or off-peak hours to peak hours. We want that apples to comparison. And then the aggregation levels is really important, right? Do you want data aggregated at 5 minutes, at 10 minutes? Do you want zero aggregation? Meaning you want per vehicle records. You want real time, every second or every minute, right? Data collected. That really plays a role. And that was a limitation that we had with the speed data. So for example, the spot speed measurements, right, are at per vehicle record. So you're able to compute 85th percentile speed. You're able to compute the number of vehicles exceeding different speed thresholds. With the RIDIS data, you're not able to do that. And so you have those limitations. And then finally, it's really important to consider the data formatting and documentation, as well as the consistency of the data. Again, the ultimate goal is that we want the before data to be able to be used with the after data. And the formatting should be, at the very least, similar. And then there needs to be some consistency in there, right? The data collection methods were done in a similar way. The characteristics collected are the same, so we can compare before, after, and have that apples to apples comparison. Before we finish, I want to thank the Oregon Department of Transportation for their collaboration and their work with us on this. Also, the research coordinator, Josh Roll, who, if you have any of the agency-specific questions, I'm happy to provide his contact information. And then the technical advisory committee, which was a fantastic technical advisory committee for this project. They were very involved, had a lot of great feedback, so I wanted to make sure to give all of them a big thank you. And with that, that concludes what we have to speak today. So thank you. Putting on moderator hat. For those viewing the webinar, please feel free to submit your questions using the Q&A feature in the control panel on the bottom of your Zoom window. And were there any questions in the room? Go for it. We'll go left to right. Yeah, go for it.
Thank you. Thank you for the presentation. My name is Derek Quiñones. I'm a PhD student studies. I have two quick questions. First, in terms of the data extraction analysis, particularly for the vehicle-pedestrian conflicts and the PET, I know the professor said that we have to compare apples to apples, but I'm wondering if you saw a difference in severity in the morning data versus the night data, compared like it was more severe at night and in the morning.
Right.
And the second question quickly, sorry, thanks, is if you consider having interviews with pedestrians and people crossing bicycles, because I think it would have given you even more information in terms of the safety of the people crossing the sidewalks.
Right. So, number one, morning and afternoon conflict data. I don't know off the top of my head. I have it in my office. I can email it to you. If you could send me an email and just remind me, I'll let you know. The second part, again, with the survey, it is a good idea. And I think that it would have been nice to ask things about, like, are you more comfortable? Do you feel safer? Are you more likely to walk to the grocery store than you were in the past? But again, we don't have anything to compare that to, right? So we would be getting a lot of nice stories, but there's doing an analysis as far as, like, do people feel more comfortable? Getting anything quantitative out of that would be difficult. Sure.
Good question. Yep.
I have a question from like a project management perspective. Is this kind of evaluation feasible or to be done more frequently with different capital improvement projects?
Yeah, so I think these before evaluations can definitely be done more frequently, assuming that the data is there. And that has to go with those before after recommendations, right? So if agencies at large want to frequent these before after evaluations, especially if they're really localized, right? We've done this project or we've implemented this at this location or at these 3 locations, right? It's not something systemic. Those before after recommendations are there to allow for more frequent before after studies because there is some consistency in terms of the data that's collected. It's in the same format. And the consideration of we're going to do this and then we're going to do an after study. And, once it's completed, like having that thought process allows more frequent before after evaluations to be done, because then you're collecting everything you need and then you can collect it after. And then you have those similar data sets that allow for that apples to apples comparison. I would also comment that inventory and archiving the data, not deleting it, is also a really important element. Sometimes spot speed measurements, for example, can disappear, or any data can disappear. So making sure that the data storage element is locked up and secure so that you have that data archived to go back to it when you want to do the before after evaluation is also.
I have a follow-up question about I know that movements along like Division, I think further down Division Southeast, businesses were kind of upset about that,
Right.
Reducing the lanes. Do you think you could use something like this to kind of make the argument that increasing foot traffic, or what I mean? Can you think about research project like this to talk to kind of inform the businesses about the shit?
Yeah, you bring up a fantastic question, and that was actually something that was brought up in our TAC meetings multiple times about getting perceptions from adjacent business owners, right, and their thoughts on it, because it's not just what happens after, it's like the construction part of it, right? It's hard for people to get to those businesses when the construction is happening as well. And so we did have a conversation about that. And we did write some of that in the report in terms of a potential recommendation to consider adjacent business owners at these project locations and potential feedback or their perceptions on certain things as well. In regards to the results of it, like, does that make them more prone to just being okay with everything? I mean, I would say I don't know the answer to that question, because you still have the construction process, which could impact their bottom line, right?
And I just wanted to add on to the feasibility of doing more of these. As technologies improve, things become available and cheaper, right? Now, I have worked on a project before that was at a different agency level, and they had access to software that was able to identify the user, spot count them, and determine speed. Whereas for this study, I did that. All of those volumes for vehicles, I counted them, right? Every person, I counted them. So that is a lot of man hours. So when you think about, can we do this more frequently? If you have improving technology, or if you have access to that, then that makes it a lot more feasible than having, someone spend 4 months viewing video.
Yeah, I'm glad Elizabeth brought that up to just go on that, and then John will get over to there. There are companies, and it's costly if you want to pay a company to analyze the video data, and then there's the learning curve of do you have someone in-house that has like the technical skills or knowledge to be able to apply these AI-based technologies to extract all of this information from the video as well. So that's a great point, Elizabeth. John.
First of all, is there any questions online that I will see mine till then first?
Doesn't matter. Let's see. All right. Are the PET thresholds standardized, or were they chosen based on some logic or arbitrarily? So the PET thresholds were based on previous research done by one of my co-PI for this, which was Sarisha, and as well as Elizabeth. And then we've also used those thresholds in some NCHRP work. So they were not just pulled out of thin air. They were not chosen arbitrarily. They were based on some previous research that colleagues have done, as well as that we've done ourselves. Let's read. For calculating PET, were those calculated manually by a human, or was video analytics software used? So yeah, no video analytics software was used for this project. Any calculations and anything reduced from the video was all done by our fantastic graduate student, Elizabeth. So this question is, are you sure the reduction of VMT and speed is associated with working from home? Lesser extent of commuting in 2023, which you implied in the presentation. Would there be any other effects, say law enforcement nearby the corridor, other surrogate route for communicating, construction, reroutes, etc. in the vicinity? Just throw so yeah, I 100% agree with you. I don't think it's fair to point it all towards working from home. That could just be an element. Which is why we also stated that to really understand what's that change in VMT, not just on the corridor, but across Portland as a whole, we would need some more specific VMT-based studies to really understand what's going on there.
I'd like to just, one of my questions was that,
Sure.
Is that, you saw this decrease in VMTs, pretty significant, in that corridor.
Right.
But you were also saying that there was only a minimized reduction in travel time during that corridor. The question is, if you had kept VMT at what rate it was going to be, what travel time could you have, would you have seen increased? And so is it part VMT is going somewhere else? Is it staying at home? Is it a decrease? Is it a mode shift? We didn't even,
Right.
we didn't even
Right.
talk about number of bicycle increases in the corridor.
Yep.
But, or pedestrian, but, I think you're seeing some of that minimize travel time. Because of that significant
Sure.
VMT reduction.
Yeah, I would agree with you 100%. And those mode shifting is a fantastic point to make in regards to people, like Elizabeth mentioned early on, she saw a lot more electric bikes in the after period than in the before period. And so it just really goes back to, we just really don't fully understand where that VMT is going. So we looked at those neighboring streets, right? Or those similar streets, and they're seeing reductions in VMT too.
Yeah.
So what is that? And again, that to really answer that question, we would need to dive into the weeds, specifically looking at VMT and what's happening on those corridors. But I would assume it's kind of a mixture of everything.
And I was gonna comment about this when the slide was up, but also, the TAC did raise the concern, well, if they're leaving Lombard, are they just
Sure.
flooding Columbia and Willamette? But, they have decreases greater than the average for arterials in Portland in general. So we know they're not just going to other arterials and clogging those up.
Yeah, for the PET, it seemed like the vast majority of the decrease in those conflicts came from Denver. I want to say that's the intersection.
Sure.
What about that specific intersection caused such a decrease compared to the other ones?
Denver. I'm trying to remember off the top of my head. It's travel time. Denver. What's interesting is Denver was the end point for me with the video. And so I would have to say a lot of that must come from reduced exposure. Because Denver did not receive a lot of intervention when it comes to that. Denver is where it goes from being the one lane each direction with the center turn lane back to 2 lanes. So I would say in the before period, right, you had 2 lanes in each direction both ways. And in the after period, I think it's the same.
All right, so we're a little bit past time. So for those viewing the webinar, please feel free to submit your questions. Oh, I already said that part. Thank you for attending today's Friday Transportation Seminar. For those of you joining remotely, after the seminar ends, you'll have the opportunity to complete a brief survey about today's event. It only takes a few minutes and we would really appreciate your feedback. Also, if any of your questions didn't get answered, recall that those get forwarded to Elizabeth and myself and we can answer those questions for you. So once again, thank you so much for joining us today and listening to us talk about this multimodal safety project.